My name is Meera Zassenhaus, and I'm head of communications here at Tucka. And a big part of what I do is liaison between the School of Engineering and the rest of the university, especially the Friedman School, with the goal of putting bench researchers side by side with social scientists and future policymakers to think proactively about the responsible commercialization of the technologies we're developing in the lab. And so I'm excited to talk here with Alex and Nicole, who will introduce themselves in a second, about a new project we're working on to that effect here at Tucka. So the idea of farmers has been referenced a couple times throughout the day. And I think, as we're all familiar with, especially in this last year, talk of disruption and this idea of cultivated meat putting farmers out of business has dominated the media, especially with a high-profile and rather theatrical ban in Florida. But all of that discourse, both the criticisms being levied against cultivated meat and the rebuttals by the industry itself, have all been speculative because there's no research or data really mapping out the impact that this technology might have on livestock producers or workers or rural communities. But that changes today. So I'm really, really, really happy to share that Tucka has been awarded a multi-year USDA grant to map out the social implications of cellular agriculture technology on the livestock industry. So really rigorously, yeah, it's all Nicole. But to rigorously project, sort of the impact that what we're working on at Tucka might have on meatpacking workers and cow-calf producers. So the focus is really on beef. And so Nicole, Dr. Nicole Blackstone from the Friedman School is spearheading this project, which will involve on-the-ground, like field interviews with cow-calf producers and meatpacking workers conducted by Alex from the anthropology department. So maybe to start, you two can both introduce yourselves and your backgrounds and how you came to CellAg and Tucka.
Sure. Thanks, Meera. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Blackstone. I'm an assistant professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy and have a secondary appointment in the Department of Biomedical Engineering as of very recently, which is exciting. I am a sustainability scientist by training. So in my research, I analyze the environmental and social impacts of different types of innovations, interventions, and policy. And one of the innovations in my portfolio today and kind of hopefully for the foreseeable future is looking at the potential impacts of cultivated meat under different scenarios. The toolbox that I use primarily as a researcher, so I was so glad to hear on the last panel discussion of life cycle assessment. So I am a life cycle assessment practitioner. I conduct social and environmental life cycle assessments on different kinds of systems. And so in this project that Meera mentioned, one of the pillars of the work that we're going to be doing is actually a social life cycle assessment of the development of cultivated meat into the future under different kind of commercialization scenarios. And we're really excited to be kicking this off and to be kind of bringing this perspective to the field and these conversations to the fore. How I got into cellular agriculture was actually just an email from this guy right here, who I believe the email was, hey, I heard that you do life cycle assessments. Do you have any interest in working in cellular agriculture? And that was maybe 4-ish years ago. And that was the beginning of a beautiful and fruitful and really fun relationship working in this space and kind of bringing my expertise in traditional terrestrial agriculture and food systems sustainability assessment to this space. So I'm glad I'm here. Excited to be advancing the field and in conversation with you all, and I guess I'll hand it over to Alex.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talks today. I've learned a lot. I sort of feel like the interconnected polar opposite of this crowd. I'm a humanistic cultural anthropologist who studies work in capitalism, and most of my publications have been in conventional or industrial meat production. I'm also an ethnographer, which means that my core method of study is to actually participate in the processes that I study, rather than, simply relying on statistics or stories or reported speech about these operations. For my own work, I've spent 3 years living in a company town organized around industrial pork production, working through most of the stages of production, and also shadowing managers across others. In 2020, I published a book called Porkopolis, which is an ethnographic study of sort of the limits of industrial pork production, especially of this system that, at least at the slaughterhouse level, has now been in operation for about 130 years, and every decade or so growing and growing and growing sequentially. The book that I ended up writing is kind of about the ways that different pork corporations are starting to feel the limits of additional growth. They feel structurally compelled to grow, but they struggle to imagine how to increase the scale of slaughter in the plants. They struggle to figure out how to, speed the pace of growth of animals and so forth. And my book ends up looking at their efforts nonetheless to break through these limits and the fallout on human communities and animals and rural environments. How did I get into this? Again, I think an email from Sean and Nicole. I'm currently trying to write a follow-up book of sorts, a researcher book that's proving challenging and perhaps a little bit odd at first, but I'm trying to study quitters of industrial meat production. Slaughterhouses in so-called good times in the United States average about 100% annual turnover rate, but we don't. And that figure can be a little deceptive. People might move from one plant to another, they might quit and then come back. But I think we actually have fairly little data on what's driving people to try to leave this industry, of their struggles and travails to try to get out. So I'm trying to build a network of folks to really work through this systematically. And I won't get too much into the details, but after researching my first book for 10 years, it came out in May 2020, at the exact moment when COVID's kind of racking slaughterhouses. And we're getting a lot of front page news stories that are saying, in effect, workers face an impossible choice. They can either quit, and though the stories didn't say that, presumably starve or something like that, or they can go to work and be sickened. And at the exact moment I'm reading these stories, I start reaching back out to some of the, actually hundreds of people that I interviewed and engaged in my first book, and hardly any still worked in the pork industry, at least amongst waged workers. And so I really wanted to sort of develop a more systematic study that takes seriously people's efforts, the people who know it most intimately and best, their efforts to try to leave it. And I think that's what got me into the Secatli project a little bit, which we'll talk about, which I thought it would be really interesting to do some interviews with meatpacking workers, with small beef producers, to understand whether they actually see these kinds of processes as a threat to their livelihoods, whether they're actually dependent on the industry in the ways that it's imagined. That's all.
Thank you. So Nicole, you're really the architect of this grant, and I know that you've been interested in doing this kind of work for a while. So can you talk about your motivations for this project? Because we're just starting. We only kicked off a few months ago, and how you see it sort of developing over time, both in this grant and then beyond, maybe with future projects.
Yeah, so first I'll say it's really a team effort. So it's myself, Alex, and the other members of our core team who are not up on stage today are Dr. Sean Cash, who's an economist at the Friedman School, and Dr. Kathy Fuller, who is an economist at Oregon State University and was formerly a postdoc with us. And so this is sort of our collective brainchild. And I think the reason for getting into this particular area of inquiry, there are a few different reasons. I would say we talk a lot in these spaces about this technology has the potential to be disruptive, right? And sometimes in the spaces we use language like we're gonna end industrial animal agriculture, we're gonna end animal agriculture, there are gonna need to be no more farms, this sort of thing. And I think, well, I don't think that language is helpful, but that's a digression. I think that we're researchers, and so we wanted to ask the question from an empirical standpoint, okay, what might actually happen? How can we study what might actually happen in this kind of a transition, and how are positive and negative impacts on workers, communities, animals, people how might these things be distributed in the future? And so that was the real impetus for wanting to bring some kind of hard science and data and stories and hearing from practitioners and workers themselves about how they see themselves in this transition and how we might think about different futures and what this could look like under kind of different scenarios. So we wanted to bring kind of the social and sciences to it. And I'll say maybe more broadly speaking, where I think the work is going, or where I would like the work to go, is I see this project as an opportunity that we are taking to connect production agriculture with cellular agriculture. So for example, our advisory board is experts and practitioners and academics across cell ag, across the beef industry. We have a large feed yard operator on our advisory board, right? And we're bringing all of these folks together to ask these questions and to try to connect, right? And talk about this and have people in the same room at the same table. And that's the kind of work that I would like to continue doing in this space, is thinking about how we build bridges between production agriculture and cellular agriculture to imagine futures together. So I would say, like, kind of longer term ambition, I would really like this to kind of build out into, more public science, more engagement, more, shared tables, that sort of thing.
I'm going to zoom in. You mentioned transition and how people might be thinking about the transition to cell ag. One of the first topics when I came to Tufts, I think I scheduled like convos with both of you, talking about like my interest in what a just transition to cell ag might look like, and how TUCA, as this sort of like interdisciplinary research institute, can start thinking through that. So what does a just transition maybe mean to you, and how do you see this project sort of laying the groundwork for future work on that topic, maybe here at Tufts or elsewhere?
So I think a just transition in this space, that's a really good question, Meera. I think what matters to me most is that we bring people's valid concerns and values to the fore and have real conversations about how this might play out. Like, it may be the case that, meatpacking workers, for example, like, adapt and could do other jobs and it could work really well, right? There are lots of different ways that this could play out, but I think for me, a just transition means actually trying to center the voices of the folks who are presently marginalized in these systems. So for example, we often don't think about farmers as being marginalized, but in the beef industry, cow-calf operators, which are small producers. These are folks who are maintaining small herds of cows, maybe like 50, I think, is average herd size for the U.S. These are mom and pop operations all over the country. This is grass-based primarily. And this kind of livelihood is a major livelihood strategy. It's the top livelihood strategy for Black producers, for Indigenous producers, for Hispanic producers in this country, folks who have been, in many cases, like actively discriminated against, disenfranchised. And so I think if we're talking about, and they're at the margins, right? A lot of these folks are struggling to keep their business together. So I think if we're gonna talk about transition, like, we have to be bringing that up. We have to be talking about that. We have to be talking with those folks and thinking through, how do we get through a transition like that? Or do we support these producers? What does it look like? So to me, it's about trying to unearth and center marginalized voices and then, make decisions, forward-looking decisions, and try to inform policy, I would say. Alex, I don't know if you want to comment on the just transition piece.
I don't have much to add other than just emphasizing that lots of people who are classed as manual laborers, quote unquote, in the animal production industries actually have voices. You know what I mean? That they actually have viewpoints, they actually have expertise. When I worked in a CAFO, the people that were running it, and were oftentimes very, very critical of it, right? Oftentimes the most vociferous critiques I encountered were from workers, but they were people that were nonetheless had the knowledge to try to keep these very fragile systems somewhat afloat. And I think so. I just think part of even beginning to imagine a just transition is also to break down our divisions of, frankly, class. we could easily imagine that, you know, a just transition is debated and negotiated amongst the people who run companies or own capital and so forth. But I really, just to echo Nicole, think we really need to pay attention to the people who are oftentimes most marginalized, but also sometimes most integral to these operations.
Yeah, that segues into my next question, which is that you're going to be doing field work and conducting interviews with meatpacking workers and beef producers to sort of understand how cultivated meat might impact their livelihoods. And this idea of the farmer, like farmers keep coming up as like this community that might get disrupted, but there's a whole cast of there are workers, and there's like a whole cast of characters beyond those who are classified as farmers. So can you sort of parse that a bit? Because I feel like there's something a little bit slippery rhetorically happening with like this constant invocation of the farmer as opposed to the worker.
Yeah, that's really important. Look, in this low margin industries, like industrial meat production, there is a constant effort to try to wring more and more and more value from these organisms, and that oftentimes means more and more work. Like the pig production sites that I studied had 1,100 SKUs that could potentially be put onto any pig, right? Lots of that's different cuts of meat, or really just even sometimes identical cuts of meat for a different wholesaler. But other parts are like taking all of the fat and turning it into biodiesel, different kinds of pet food palatants, all sorts of this unending cascade of more and more jobs and forms of work and so forth that actually kind of contributes, or is one of the many factors that contributes to this extremely low price of meat that we've been kind of grappling with. But more broadly, yeah, I am always just kind of stunned at the invisibility of workers in these systems. I think it's partially tied to our own divisions of labor in academia and otherwise. You know, I really take as crucial and important and inspiring, say, land grant and extension work to represent and engage the views of the producer. But the pork corporation I studied, which is one of the biggest, they don't contract with farmers. They own all of the land and the barns themselves. The people who are the producers are waged workers. And until actually a civil eats piece 2.5 years ago, it was as if these populations of, and I'm talking in this case barn workers, don't exist. I've never read a really in-depth study of everyday labor and work on a beef cattle feedlot, for instance. And you know, more broadly, I just think we make these distinctions beforehand, agricultural versus industrial, when we're really at a moment when these distinctions themselves don't make that much sense anymore, especially in highly integrated industries where the production of animal flesh for better and oftentimes worse is a product of countless different kinds of industrial and so-called agricultural labor. And at the same time, I just want to say, I mean, we could ramp this out. We could talk about trucking. We could talk about further processing and so forth. And I don't want to end with the sort of impression that like, oh, this is going to be so disruptive of people's livelihoods, right? Because there's so many attached to it. I think we also have to understand that within these operations themselves, there's a great deal of division, there's a great deal of conflict, there's a great deal of different senses as to what would be a better future for the industry or perhaps without the industry. And we actually have to engage them to begin.
So you mentioned the pork industry. This project focuses on beef as opposed to chicken or pork. So maybe, Nicole, could you talk a little bit about why in designing this grant it focused on the beef industry and how the beef value chain differs from these other species of meat?
So I think, so we've heard, you know, earlier today, and many of you are maybe in this space because you're interested in sustainability. So from an environmental perspective, right, we know that beef is incredibly carbon intensive. It's a really big resource user. So if you're going to, you know, have a product that is sort of ripe for a cellular analog, let's say, it's a really great product to be thinking about how can we make this more sustainable, right? So from a kind of environmental sustainability perspective, it's very clear to me, at least, where the kind of value proposition is there. From a scientific perspective, okay, great, it's probably gonna be great for the environment, depends on how the system's designed, but what about the social piece, right? And I think myself, members of our team have background in the beef industry in different ways. So my doctoral dissertation was actually about beef production systems and assessing the sustainability of different alternative systems like grass-fed or pastured animals. And so I have a lot of familiarity with beef value chains, and so it was a natural, and the cell ag piece too, so it was a kind of a natural place for us to really be starting to look deeply into the value chains, which is advantageous, I think, because these value chains are incredibly complex. So I'll let you kind of talk about pork if you want to, but like beef is pretty different from pork and chicken. For beef, there are typically 2 to 3 farms that are involved in getting from like calf all the way to slaughter. As I mentioned, like those, there are very small on average operations, cow-calf operations that are scattered all throughout the country. Those are predominantly, almost entirely family farms that raise calves as their business, right? And then the calves will actually go to what's called a backgrounding or a stocking operation. A lot of these folks are out west. They're maybe grazing on BLM land, et cetera. So they're on pasture predominantly. And then for the last 4 to 6 months of an animal's life, that animal is probably going to go to a feed yard. These are primarily in the Midwest and Great Plains of the United States. Most of these operations are very, very large. So I believe 80-ish% of fed cattle in the United States are fed on operations that are 1,000 or more head, so pretty big farms. So it's interesting because there's a lot of variability in the value chain, but it's not vertically integrated the way that chicken and pork is. Once you get to meat packing, you have an incredibly consolidated and concentrated industry. So the 4-firm concentration ratio for beef, which means how much of the market do 4 firms control for this commodity globally, I believe is 85%. So there are 4 companies that control 85% of beef slaughter globally. That is staggering. That's staggering. I think there is less kind of vertical coordination or contracting between big feed yards or ownership, I would say, of big feed yards and big meat packers, but it is there. It's just not the same as chicken or beef. So it's a complex supply chain. It has folks with very different interests across different geographies who would probably win or lose from this kind of a transition. So I think one thing I will say, just kind of building on Alex's comment about workers, is like when we talk about farmers or workers, let's be clear meat producers, let's be clear who we're talking about. Like if JBS, for example, is investing in cell ag, they're probably gonna benefit from their investment. That's great, but who's not gonna benefit? Probably the farmers upstream in that value chain, although there may be ways that they could be integrated. So this is why we are doing this project, to try to think systematically about both the beef value chain and the potential kind of cell-cultivated beef value chain, and think about where are there likely to be big shifts, like around work and the nature of work and who is working and what it's like, right? Around community level impacts, around, around farmer livelihoods, that sort of thing, and try to look at it from a supply chain lens and see where might there be winners and where might there be losers, and how do we create potential solutions in advance of that. So I think beef is really interesting because it's so complicated, which makes our jobs challenging, but I think it should be a really interesting case study in how to think about complexity and value chains as we think about this idea of a just transition.
We have a Slido question sort of further interrogating, I think, the complexity of the beef industry. So considering the importance of cull cattle sales to dairy farmers and that 20% of beef comes from dairy cattle, will you be investigating impact to dairy farmers as well?
I was thinking about this earlier today. So we're very early in this project, and it's really challenging to think about where to draw the boundaries. Dairy is not off the table, I would say, but our primary focus is going to be beef producers, because if we bring in dairy, it's going to be a whole other system to be grappling with, and dairy has its own set of challenges. But it's on our minds, and I hope to address it even in a cursory way in the project, because we do know how intermingled the systems are.
And then for Alex, do your findings with pork production generalize to the production of other livestock?
I mean, exactly to, I think, Nicole's point that perhaps different phases of different livestock. I mean, there's arguably less labor in chicken barns than there are, say, in pig barns. Similarly, you know, it's a very different structure upstream in beef, but a beef cattle feedlot, for instance, may have similar resonances, and then a slaughterhouse itself is you know, packing houses are different in their intensities and their labor. The actual materiality of the species involved does matter, but by and large, this is a high throughput, high pressure industry where most workers, especially in the packing house, are making, you know, thousands of repetitive motion cuts a day, and that's the work.
So one of the outputs of this project will be a social LCA, which is a new concept to me. And I think a lot of people might be familiar with your environmental life cycle assessments, which you do with Kirsten and others. So is environmental life cycle assessment, is social LCAs standardized in the same way that environmental LCAs are? And if so, if not, how do we make them comparable, or how do we trust that they're comprehensive?
Oh, this is a good question. Did I plant this question? Did someone? So there are.
Kirsten asked the question.
Okay, great. I did actually. LCA's practice just isn't standardized. Like, there are international standards for environmental LCA, but whether or not you follow them is totally, basically voluntary. So there's a lot of noise in the environmental LCA data too. Social LCA is a much newer field. Environmental LCA has been around since like the 70s. Social LCA really just started in the early 2000s. So I would say there's guidance, but it's not clear. So we are doing a lot of methodological development while we are trying to do this work. One thing I will say that there is really no roadmap for is there hasn't really been, to my knowledge, any work look at future-oriented social life cycle assessment, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, looking to the future, under different scenarios, how might the implications of this technology play out? And so we're actually building the method ourselves, and the ambition is to have it be kind of a flexible, adaptable method that can be applied to other food and agriculture technologies or other cellular agriculture technologies so that it can sort of move the field forward. So there's some guidance, but it's a little bit more of the Wild West in social LCA than it is in environmental LCA. So we're going to do our best and be transparent along the way and ask for lots of feedback.
I'll wrap up with one final question, which is, especially you, Alex, but also you, Nicole, have had a lot more engagement with farmers and workers and have been thinking about this topic, probably more thoughtfully than a lot of people here and in Cell Ag. So what sort of like advice or reflections do you have on how practitioners in cultivated meat can build trust and form better relationships with the meat industry, sort of broadly defined?
Yeah, I think this is a challenging question because I do very, very different work than what's being proposed here. I mean, there is probably, with these various projects, there are threats and perhaps benefits to the so-called meat industry, whereas I might show up in a town and be like, well, I'm a cultural anthropologist who studies pigs. And people are like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But you know, I guess the main thing I'd say is to broaden the question, to make us ask, what is the meat industry in the first place? I don't perhaps envy some of the work you all are doing and trying to do, but obviously that might entail, say, partnerships or engagement with lobbying organizations like the American Meat Institute, with various producers' councils, with various large companies, such as one of those CR4 companies. But when I begin an ethnographic study in a meatpacking town, I don't necessarily begin at the point where, first I have to get this company on board or that company on board. I think that, workers, unions, for instance, are an integral part of the meat industry. I think veterinarians are. I think a lot of different university scientists are. And so for me, at least in my own research, especially when I oftentimes encounter particular kinds of roadblocks within the broader industry, I always think, well, who else, what other groups can I begin dialogues and discussions with? And, oftentimes you find that those different players have very different interests and different senses of what the meat industry is in the first place, and perhaps involves different points of traction in discussion.
I think I would say so a few months ago, we actually did an event at Texas A&M in tandem with an annual grant meeting that Tucka was having. And the event, we brought together folks from different kind of livestock industry, myself, and we were kind of having this type of conversation, right? And something that, one of my colleagues said, who is in livestock extension, was like, ask questions, like be curious about what we do. Like, I think we should stop assuming that, farmers are willing to come to the table, or that farmers are going to benefit, or that they're going to be horrible, like it's going to be horrible for them. Like, let's just ask and talk with them and open dialogues and that sort of thing. I think that's really important to be building the bridges in the space. So I think my advice would be assume nothing, be open-minded and curious. And I wouldn't assume that just because someone, runs an operation a particular way or does something with their livelihood that you may not agree with, that they're a bad person, because they're probably not. They just may have a different way of looking at the world. So I think be generous with one another, and I think that would go a long way.
All right. Thank you so much.